Sorry I couldn't be there with you. I'm in Connecticut in the US at my home, but look forward to this session. Thanks, Sally, for moderating. So I'm going to talk about why public trust in science declined during COVID and since, and maybe a little bit about what to do about that once we understand some of the reasons for it. And I think the reasons for that decline in trust are both epistemological, some self-inflicted wounds by philosophers, some sociologists, some historians of science, and a failure to really take the duties and obligations of communication by scientists, bioethicists, and others with the public, a subject that throughout my career I've been very engaged with in terms of trying to encourage both a public face and an academic face to bioethics. So I'll almost stipulate that public confidence in biomedical science has been declining since COVID. That decline isn't as huge as some people fear, but it's there. In probably the past 4 years, the number of people who say they have a great deal of confidence that medical science acts in their best interest is down about 40%. There are lots of other polls and studies that show similar dour findings. The pandemic not only killed millions, it also undercut a long history of trust on the part of the public and public officials in science. So why? What happened? What went on that caused this? A lot of reasons, lots going on. I'm going to flag some that I think haven't gotten as much attention as they should have. So some people argue that since trust has disappeared because throughout COVID, when public health, medicine, and science were on display in a big way, universal agreement about what was going on seemed to be lacking, and that without complete agreement on the facts, an essential attribute for trust is missing. That is to say, there's a perception among many that science isn't trustworthy because its messages shift and evolve. And I'm going to say that is exactly the wrong stance to take epistemologically toward science and biomedicine. Weirdly, its willingness to shift and evolve and correct, as we just heard from the first presentation, is what is a hallmark of science. So there's a confusion about that epistemological fact, what makes science trustworthy or its statements warranted. The other group includes some sociological reasons, I think, for a loss of faith. Many note that there's been an unwillingness and an inability on the part of social media platforms to edit or censor obvious misinformation, and their tendency to feature fringe ideas to get clicks has fostered distrust in science. That is what I call pollution, misinformation. Pollution is drowning out mainstream science messages. And others note that there's a perception that science is still dominated by powerful pharmaceutical business interests, that they create conflicts of interest that undermine objectivity and thus trust in science. And still others note that there's been far less effort to educate the public about science, particularly in high schools, allowing the acceptance of fringe views or distorted thinking about what merits trust. And I think there's some truth in all of these things. But let's talk epistemology first. And I have one main theme that I want to try to drive home with you, and that is what really makes science trustworthy is not coherence of belief, is not, as some 20th century philosophers of science felt, that it had to be some notion of evidence in support of hypotheses that was convincing, or even Popperian lines of falsification. I think first and foremost, what makes science trustworthy is pragmatism. That is, the test of the warrant of any belief is not coherence with other beliefs. Obviously, again, the first presentation shows that you can have coherent beliefs without being close to anything that is worth trust, but whether the belief leads to predictable practical consequences that can be repeated. In other words, in a nutshell, what I'm going to say is throughout my career in the philosophy of science side of philosophy, you can see that in analyzing science, those parts of science that are the most practical and applied are put into almost the rear benches, that the paradigms that most people take as what constitutes science to analyze and understand are the pure and the theoretical, and that was especially true throughout a good chunk of the 20th century, and that has distorted precisely what makes scientific beliefs warranted, which is that they have consequences that are predictable and that lead out from the beliefs. So you can talk all day that bleach, hydrochloroquine, warm weather, ivermectin can kill the COVID virus, but until there's some evidence that acting on these views actually brings about the desired result and not your death, those claims are just that, claims. Anecdotes, case reports, testimonials about cures, they're all over the internet. Just for COVID, this morning I was looking around before we got going, morning my time over here, and found a parade of personal attestations alleging the value against COVID, if you're sick, of vitamin C, gargling with salt water, herbal eye drops, drinking garlic water, nebulizing and breathing hydrogen peroxide, which is a really bad idea, snorting volcanic ash, also not a good idea, chewing beta leaves, and on it goes. But no matter how fervently these claims are asserted, and they are very fervently asserted and often come with offers to sell you these things, the true test of these remedies is not personal experience, not anecdote, but repeatable, generalizable efficacy. Again, the pragmatic. So in a lot of the meta studies that philosophers and historians and sociologists have contributed to understanding what makes science science, attention to the importance of practical outcomes that derive from theories, models, and experiments, I don't think has been adequate. And I think it has really harmed our ability to educate the public about why science is trustworthy. Let me just give you one more example, and then I'll, pardon me, stop pounding this pragmatic nail. Why have scientists been so persuaded by evolutionary theory? Well, for Darwin, it wasn't simply because he had a coherent theory, it was because he knew all about domestic breeding, and he could see the application of his ideas all around him. He also studied these changes in many other species, but I think it was his garden and his connections to dog and pigeon and many other animal breeders that really convinced him that he was on the right track. In later times, Lysenkoism, efforts to use Lamarckian theory to guide agriculture, provided a very stark lesson in why Darwin was right through mass starvation all over the then Soviet Union. Evolutionary theory is still the key. We don't hear about it as much, but it's what's used to discover the location of fossil fuels when you're out looking for gas or oil deposits. It's the practical that fuels the veracity of scientific claims, even in areas like evolutionary theory, which look very theoretical and hyper-conceptual, but again, underappreciated and undercommunicated to the public in the war over who should you trust. So the warrant, I think, for scientific belief and the corresponding trust that should be accorded scientific belief derives in significant part, not only, but significantly from the demonstrated practical efficacy of these beliefs. Your theory about disease, about prevention of disease, about therapy is really only as good as the coroner reports associated with them. And it is that message. Let's look to results. Let's look to outcomes. If you want to take it into areas like climate change, let's look to floods. Let's look to heat domes. That's where the battle about trust is won. It isn't just about here's numbers on temperature change. It's about the fact that worldwide you can see climate change playing out in a practical manner. So let me move on to some of the sociological comments here. In addition to these epistemological problems of selling science not because it's scientists, or selling science not because it has elegant theories, plenty of people have elegant theories, selling it not because there are anecdotes, selling it because it can replicate important results and show either failure or success. If you look at comments from Francis Collins during COVID and after, the head of the USA's National Institutes of Health and a White House science advisor, he kept saying, the big thing I know I didn't do, I'm quoting him, and I don't think a lot of our communicators did, was to say, this is an evolving crisis. This will change every time we make a recommendation, meaning advice, whether about social distancing or masking or wearing vaccines. And as a result, we lost public confidence as a result of our inability to explain to the public that we change our views in light of either the facts changing or finding out that what we thought was true is false. Huge barriers exist to competent communication by scientists and researchers with the public. Collins is not wrong about the inability to explain that science changes in response to failure. But I think what we've done in science and somewhat in bioethics is not require us, our communities, to communicate with the public. It's hard to trust those you don't hear from or you can't see very often. And it's hard to trust those who don't appear locally or in your community when others, say COVID disinformationists or ideologues about what to do with respect to a pandemic, constantly show up at local events and meetings and send out their messages. Efforts to engage the public are not only not encouraged in science, they are not at all rewarded in science currently by the institutions that employ scientists and public health experts. Institutions are more likely to warn their employees, their students, and their faculties against spending time trying to communicate with the public, trying to get them off social media, trying to get them off blogs, trying to have them not do online chats. There's no metric that I know of that ever is used to evaluate the amount or the quality of outreach effort that scientists use, or, and I'll put this in a subparagraph so we can all fight about it, bioethicists, in trying to get any credit in terms of grants or promotions. Science and medical research in the US and around the world depend a lot on public funding, generous, in my view, overly generous patent protection, and tax advantages. All too often, the priorities in those funding is set by voices that get congressional attention. In the US, in a culture that's celebrity crazy, celebrities and movie stars have a lot more to say about what gets funded in science than scientists sometimes do. If you look at what happened during COVID, there were almost no systematic efforts beyond a very few people to encourage, prepare, and reward people to engage in public venues. We can all think of people who did communicate as scientists during COVID and after from around the world. Tony Fauci is a notable American who did so. People like Peter Hotez, Paul Offit were American communicators who did so. There were others in Germany, the UK, and other nations who did so. But there weren't a lot of them. You could almost count them on two hands. Trust requires, if you will, belief in both the message, getting the epistemology right about why you should trust what science says, practical difference and outcome, not elegant theory, not number of publications, not backed up by papers, but it makes a difference in terms of your life or what we're trying to achieve, and competent communicators who feel an obligation as part of being a scientist to go out to the public and communicate their views. I'll wrap up that lament simply by saying we haven't figured out that every scientist should get some training in public communication, that every grant should have a requirement to communicate the results of that grant to the public as best is possible. Not everything lends itself to that, but when it could, it should, and it doesn't. And then figuring out, well, what are we going to say about the public face of areas, including bioethics, relative to rewarding or honoring or promoting or advantaging those people who train and then try to do it. Not only do we want to see people do it, but we want to evaluate how well do they do it. Do we have the means by which to say that they are doing it and they should keep track of it? I've been in my career at a lot of promotion and tenure committees. The number of people who've said, let's say something positive about the fact that X is a communicator is somewhere between 0 and never. And that's probably a generous measure. So I think the reason for loss of trust is both epistemological. We don't give the right picture to the public about why they should trust what science says, and a sociological failure. We don't try competently to convey the messages that we want to. We often wind up saying, I'm the scientist, do what I say, or I'm the scientist, I've got a lot of publications, you don't. That's not how to win the communication war. I don't think we've learned that lesson from COVID, or for that matter, somewhat in climate change. So I fear we've got to be more aggressive going forward. Thank you.